Mishpotim. And there are so many mitzvahs in Parshas Mishpotim, but I usually prefer something that is not only fascinating and gishmak, but also nogei halacha lamaisa. And today we will be discussing a certain halacha associated with basar b'cholav. 3 times in the Torah we learn the posuk lo savashel gedi b'chalev imoi, and one of them is in Parshas Mishpotim. And the Gemara says, nowhere does the Torah prohibit eating basar b'cholav or deriving benefit from basar b'cholav. No isur achila, no isur hanoah. But because this posuk we find 3 times in the Torah, lo savashel gedi b'chalev imoi, echod isur achila, echod isur hanoah, ve'echod isur bishul. But before starting the Shiur, I want to dedicate today's Shiur le'ilui nishmas, 2 beautiful children, Osher Menachem and Yankov Yisrael Palei, b'nei Avram Noach, shi'abodel l'chaim tovim aruchim. The entire Jewish world is in a state of shock and mourning over the terrible tragedy last day of Shabbos, when a beast, a terrorist, drove his car into a big group of people that were preparing L'Kavod Shabbos. And these 2 little children were killed. One died on Friday and the other on Shabbos Kodesh. This morning I went to be Menachem the family. What an amazing, unbelievable woman, the wife of Avram Noach, the mother of Osher Menachem and Yankov Yisrael is. What a Kiddush Hashem she's doing in the entire world. Kabbalas Yisurim Ba'ahava, heartbroken, shattered, but full of emunah, full of betochen and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we dedicate today's Shiur le'ili nishmosim of these 2 tinoikes shel Beis Rabam, kedoshim v'tohirim shelo yitamu tam chet, Osher Menachem and Yankov Yisrael b'nei Avram Noach. Rabbi Avram Noach, known as Avrami, I know him very well. A gewaltige Talmud Chochem, and such a wonderful, precious human being. And he's in the hospital, not in very good condition. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu should send him a refuah shleima min hashamayim. Avram Noach, ben Yehudis, le'ramach yevorov u'shesog yedov. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give koyach to the entire family, to the mother, and to all the children and the parents. Kadosh Baruch Hu should give them koyach to carry on and to have so much nachas and simchas. So today we're just dealing with a sugya of basar b'cholav. And which is that sugya? We find that Chazal were metaken many harchakas in basar b'cholav. Min haTorah, the prohibition, the Isser, is only derech bishul. It is only if the basar and the cholav, the meat and the milk, were cooked together. Chazal asered, even if they weren't cooked together. Chazal asered basarov, which is not also in a Torah, only midarabonon. And there are so many halachakas. You need to wait 6 hours, which is definitely a derabonon, fundamentally a minig. You can't eat basar b'cholav of 2 people on the same table. There are so many dinam of maris ayin and basar b'cholav. Our fundamental question is, could you have milk products and meat products in the same fridge, in the same cabinet, on the same shelf? Or would that also be a prohibition? Fascinating sugya. And I remember my great Rebbe, the Kloisenberger Rebbe, I don't think this was a psak, but it's quoted in various different forum, that lechatchila one should have a separate fridge for dairy products and a separate fridge for meat products. Well, not everyone could afford it. And besides the expense, the money, most people nowadays don't have room in their kitchen for 2 refrigerators. So some of the people I visit in America have huge homes and they have space for 20 refrigerators, but most of the people of my community living in Etzisol, or even in America, especially in Etzisol, in these little apartments, no place in the world on your baida, maybe on the roof of your house, you could have a second fridge. So, is this a halachic requirement? And that's the topic we will be discussing today. Chulun Kuf Yud Beis Medal of the Gemara has an boy. Could you put kade de milcha ve kade de kimcha one next to the other? You have a bowl of salt and a bowl of milk, cheese, a dairy product. And usually, kimcha wasn't eaten on its own. It was like a spice, which you used to spray or put on salads or other types of foods. And the Gemara says you cannot have kadat milcha v'kadat kimcha one next to the other because we are afraid that he will take some of that kimcha, which is dairy, and it'll drop on to the salt, and then he will use the salt to salt a meat product, a piece of steak. And that would be basa b'cholav, even though it wouldn't be a basa b'cholav d'oraisa, but it still would be basa b'cholav. And therefore one should not have kada de kimcha and kada de milcha one next to the other. And the Gemara asks, how about kada de kimcha and kamcha de chalo? And the Gemara differentiates between melach, salt, and vinegar. But vinegar we're not afraid, because even if a drop of the kimcha would spill over to the vinegar, it would be bottled b'loiv. And therefore, bottled b'shishim, and therefore, we do not need to be afraid. So when we learn this sugya, it seems to be clear that you cannot have a milk product and a meat product one next to the other, because we should be afraid that a drop of milk might pass over to the meat or the other way around. The Gemara even prohibits next to salt. The salt is not fleshy, but you might use that salt to salt a piece of meat, and that seems to be even a more remote cheshash. And after pecan, the Gemara says it is a prohibition. But then there's another sugya which seems to contradict this fundamental halacha, and that is an avodah zarah yud aleph amud beis. Perikishin avodah zarah deals with lifnei ideyim, with a chashash of avodah zarah. So the Mishnah says, if there is a city in which there is idol worshipping going on, and much of the stuff in the city is the klovis of avodah zarah, which is also ba'anah, but what's out of the city is permissible. And if the avodah zarah is out of town, what's in the town is permissible. And we're not choshesh, maybe things got mixed up. And the Gemara compares the halacha of this Mishnah. Didn't you see Yisrael va'oiv de kechovim sheshoifsim shtei kedere ze liyad ze v'lo chayshinan? So the Gemara says a Jew and a non-Jew could, on the same gas range, on the same stove top, have two pots. The non-Jew cooking his meat and the Jew cooking his meat. And we're not afraid, and there is no prohibition. And there are two interpretations of the Gemara buying it over. What would we be afraid of? What should we be afraid of? What is the chashash? One pshat is, maybe the Jew, the Yid, will just look the other way, and the Goy will take a piece of nevela and flip it into the pot of the Jew. We're not choshesh. The other says we're not choshesh that maybe a drop of roit of nevela, spilled out of the non-Jew's pot into the Jew's pot. When you throw something into a pot, some fluid, some sauce, some soup might squirt out or spill over. We're not choshesh. So the Gemara compares, just like we're not choshesh two pots, one next to the other, maybe there was some confusion and Isser got into heter. Same logic, we're not choshesh. If avodah zarah in the city, we're not choshesh out of town, or the other way around. But this Gemara seems clearly to say two pots, one right next to the other, and it is permissible. So what is the difference between two bowls, kimcha and milcha, which is asur, chur and kuf yud beis, And Avodah Zorah, Yud Aleph Amud Beis, going over to Yud Beis Amud Aleph, 2 pots, one is Nevela, one is kosher, and that is permissible. Rashbu Teres Abayis, Beis Daled Shar Aleph, Beis Daled Shar Aleph. The Rashbu asks this question, and he does not give a clear verdict. He quotes the Rambam. The Rambam has a different interpretation in the Gemara and Chulin. And the Rambam says salt has a tendency to be sho'ev. Not always do I find the right terminology in English. Sho'ev means pull out, absorb. And I think that it is really part of nature. Salt usually coagulates. If you have a salt shaker, some people put in rice to absorb the moisture because otherwise it would become sticky and we would have one piece of salt. It coagulates, and probably that is what the Rambam means, that it's shoyev. So the Rambam's interpretation of the Gemara is, we're not afraid that some of the kimcha might spill over and drop onto the milcha, but rather, if they're so close together, the salt will get a taste, a flavor of the dairy product, of the milk, even though they will have no contact. But the Rashba says it's a taima. But that is the Rambam. Let's have a look at the Rambam. Perik Tes Halacha Chofai, and I'm reading to you the Rambam. Ein menichin kad shel melach, b'tzad kem shel kimach. מפני ששויב ממנו ונמצא מבשל הבוסר במלח זה שיש בו טעם חלב. שיש בו טעם חלב. The Rashba rejects the interpretation of the Rambam. So what is the halacha? Tosfos Chulin, on the spot, Kuf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, Tosfos writes, we should not learn from this Gemara that it is a prohibition to put 2 bowls, 2 dishes, 2 foodstuffs, one melachig, one fleishig, beteva achas in the same box. So in the days of Tosfos there was no refrigeration, but there were cabinets. And Tosfos speaks about teva achas. You can put melachig and fleishig, dairy and meat in the same box, one next to the other. And we should not learn from this sugya that it is a prohibition. And Tosfos explains why. Usually people are aware of the Isser of Basa B'cholav. And therefore, if you put a dairy product next to a meat product, Nizar Yafa. We could rely that people are careful. So why would Kada the Kimcha and Kada the Milcha be different? Tosfos doesn't explain, but I think Pshat and Tosfos is very simple. Because we're dealing with salt. Salt is not fleshig. And therefore he wouldn't be so cautious, he wouldn't be so careful. Because even if a drop of the milk spills over or drops onto the salt, there's no issa. It is only at stage number 2 where you're going to take that salt and salt a piece of meat. That is when the problem will arise, and therefore he is not as cautious and careful. And that is why Chazal answered. But Tosfos says you aren't allowed to put milk and meat in the same box. So according to Tosfos, you definitely don't need an extra fridge. Or Zarua Mesachet Chelen Tov Samaches disagrees, and he quotes his great Rebbe, the Rivash. Not the Bitzach Bar Sheshet, but the Rivash, one of the Rishonim, the Rebbe of the Zarua, and he says you are not allowed to put milk and dairy and meat in the same box. Lechatchila yesh lahachmir. So the Zarua writes, we could differentiate between the 2 halachas. And he offers a different explanation why this harsh halacha may only apply to kada the milcha and kada the kimcha, to salt and cheese, because any other dish is just for a short period of time. So you have a melchia salad, you have a piece of cheese. You're going to eat it within a day, within 2 days, even today. We have refrigeration. But both kimcha and milcha are not consumed as is. They're just used to add on to salads, to salt different dishes, and therefore they are one next to the other, liyamim rabim, for an extended period of time, and that is why we are choishish. However, the Ozerua says, yesh lahachmir. So this is a machlokes and a shayim. And this machlekes goes over to the Shulchan Aruch as well. Tzadikei Sivov. Shulchan Aruch is lenient, following Tosfos, and the Ramah writes lechatchila yesh lizor. The Lashon of the Ramah is toiv lizor, following in the footsteps of the Or Zarua. However, even the Ramah writes toiv lizor b'mokem she'ein tzorech. So, 2 points are clear in the Ramah. It's not me'ikar adin. Toiv lizor. It's a recommendation. It's a midas chasidus. B'mokem she'ein tzorech. But if it's a shas adchak and there is a need, one could be lenient. Point number 3, which is very relevant, or as it was, what is the Ramah? If you're makbet to cover those dishes, the meat and the milk, or even one of the two, then once again, it is mutar lechat chila. That is one halacha, Yordei Tzadikein, Hilchas Basa B'cholav, and that halacha is based on the sugya in Chulim, Kada de Milcha v'Kada de Kimcha. There's another halacha in Kuf Yud Ches Sifarav, and that is based on the sugya in Avodah Zorah. Shnei Kederos, a Jew and a non-Jew, Nevela and Basa Toer, Basa Kosher, on the same kirayim, on the same stovetop, and that is permissible. The Ramah, once again, the Shitosa writes, Yesh li zoher. Lechatchila, one should not do that. So the Ramah, the Shitosa, and the Shulchan Aruch, the Shitosa. Tzadik Zayin Sif Aleph, source number 3. And this seems to be a contradiction in the Ramah, because in the other two sources that we quoted before, Tzadik and Kuf Yud Ches, the Ramah writes, it's just a lechatchila. Tzadik Zayin Sif Aleph, the Ramah says you cannot bake in the same oven a piece of bread and a piece of meat in the same oven. And we are afraid that some sauce fluids will ooze out of the meat, and they will seep out of the meat and run over to the bread, and the bread will become fleishig. So why, in this halacha, that are more paskins, and this is a clear psaka, not a chumrah, that it's also. The source of this halacha is Hagosar Shemesechet Avodah Zorah, Isur V'Heter. I just want to comment. Hagosar She'enis V'Heter say, right, Yesh Li Zorah, and the Ramah seems to be less lenient, and he says, from the Ramah's mashma, it's a prohibition. I don't think it has anything to do with the previous two sources. The previous two sources is when the foodstuffs are either in a pot being cooked or in a bowl. We're not afraid that things will spill over from one pot to the other, or a drop will nitzoitzos is called in Lashon Kodesh. You know, that some drop either of milk or meat will squirt from one bowl to the other, from one pot to the other. But in an oven, neither the meat nor the bread are in a pot, or in a bowl, or in a vessel. You cook bread, and the bread is b'dfari satana. Both the meat and the bread are exposed. They're not enclosed. And it is the nature, when you heat up a piece of meat, especially if it's steak, then much of the fat or the fluids will ooze out and run over to the other side of the oven, and therefore it is far more reasonable to be choshesh when you have meat and a loaf of bread in the same oven than two pots on the stove or two bowls, one next to the other. And I think this is Amilta de Pshita, source number 4, which is the last source in Dalat Shal Chelka Shulchan Aruch, which is somewhat relevant to our question, brings us from Yoredeya to Orechaim. Ilches Pesach Tov Mem Siv Gimel. If an non-Jew walks into a Jewish home with a sandwich, with a cheeseburger, in the middle of Pesach, it's clearly chumetz. You don't need to throw him out of the house. And there's no prohibition of having a non-Jew eat chumetz in my home on Pesach. Doesn't seem friendly, doesn't seem right. I don't think anybody would let a non-Jew eat a sandwich in his home, in his own private domain on Pesach. But al pi halacha, no issue whatsoever. I bear no responsibility. It says it's not mine. But you cannot eat on the same table. Even though there's a different tablecloth. Regarding basa b'cholav, it is permissible. If there's a heker, one side of the table somebody's eating meat and the other side somebody's eating milk, if there's a separate tablecloth and there's a heker, it is permissible regarding basa b'cholav, not regarding chametz b'pesach. And the Mishnah Berurah explains two different reasonings. Siv Kotten Yud Ches. Basa b'cholav is bottled b'shishim. Chametz afilu b'elef loy bottled. And it's almost inevitable that a little crumb of bread might fall onto the other side of the table into the Jews' food. To me, it seems a bit far-fetched. Kemat I efsher, writes the Magen the Mishnah Berurah. It's inevitable. I don't think it's inevitable. But anyway, this is the halacha. But that refers only to Pesach. And I don't think it's similar to our two fundamental and basic sources which the Rishonim deal with. Two bowls, kimcha and milcha, salt and milk, two pots, nevela and basa kosher. So regarding kimcha and milcha, the Gemara says also, but most of the Rishonim, Shulchan Aruch, following Taisus' opinion, even the Ramah is only machmir lechatchila, it's a chumrah, toiv lizohar. So the Ikar Halacha is like we find in Avodah Zarah. Yes, two pots, one next to the other, and you don't need to be chayshish. It's different when people eat. When you eat, you're picking it up, you're biting, you're taking, you stretch out your hand, you're dealing with food, and it is far more possible that a drop of bread, a crumb of bread, will just roll across the table onto the other side, and the Jew might be nichshal in a masher or chametz. So we brought four sources, and we differentiate between one and the other. The two most fundamental and important sources are two Gemaras. The Gemara about Kimcha and Milcha, which is Yordei Tzadikei, Avodah Zarah Yud Beis, Yisrael va'oived kechovim sheshoifsim shnei kederos, and that is permissible. Source number 3 is having meat and bread in the same oven, and we explained leziva chayshinan lenetzaitzais lo chayshinan. Source number 4, Hilchas Pesach, a Jew and a non-Jew eating on the same table, and by Pesach we're machmir. Maybe that chumrah is only regarding Pesach, and many halachas were machmir Pesach more than any other area, but there's also a different chashash and a different scenario and a different situation. And I think it is more reasonable to be afraid when two people are eating in the same table. And when you eat, you speak to each other, and when people speak, some people, when they speak, they spit out food, and you're engaging food, and the chashash is greater, and therefore, Shulchan Aruch asks. Now I want to go back more than 200 years, almost 300 years back, in Italy. Two Gedolim in Italy deal with the same question extensively. Shalas Teshuvas Mayim Rabim was one of the Gedolim in Italy at that period, and Shalas Teshuvas Shemesh Tzedakah was the Rav of Anakona, Rabbi Rafal Morforgo. And these two Gedolim dealt with a non-Jewish baker, and he had part of his bakery in which he baked bread for the Jewish community, or cake for the Jewish community. And we're not discussing today the question of Pasakum, and certain circumstances were made by Pasakum. We're dealing with a baker. He baked bread for the non-Jewish community with pig oil, shuman chazia. And at the same bakery, in the other side of the bakery, he baked bread for the Jewish community. Probably had hechsha, I don't know. Is it permissible or not? Mayim Rabim, Shalat Shuvas Chelik Beis. 9 Shuvas, I think 10, from Hey to Siman Yudalad. Very lengthy discussion. He leans toward leniency. No, I think he answers. Shemesh Tzeduk Yerodei Semem Zayin leads toward leniency, but at the end of the day, he also writes Yesh Lahachmir. Once again, this is source number 5, and I think it's different than all the 4 previous sources. On one hand, I think it was a different oven, but it's the same premises and the same bakery. And we're dealing with huge quantities. It's a community bakery. It's not the kitchen. It's not one pot next to the other, one bowl next to the other. A guest sitting at the other side of my table. This is going on b'kvius, and it is almost inevitable that things won't get confused, won't get mixed up, and some of the chazia fat might find its way into the Jewish bread, and that is why the great poskim of Italy, going back hundreds of years, paskim the chumrah. So we brought 5 sources. And at the beginning of today's shiur, I said our fundamental question, and I wrote a tshuva about this not long ago. So could you have dairy products and meat products in the same fridge? Well, anybody listening to my shiur probably thinks to himself, what are you talking about? Everybody does. And it's true, everybody does. But things that everybody does, we still need to understand, is it okay or not? We could assume it's okay. But I really think, based on our halachic analysis and discussion today, it is permissible for 3 different reasons. Even the Ramah is machmir, yesh lahachmir b'mokom she'ein tzorech. B'mokom she'yesh tzorech, even the Ramah is mekel. Shulchan Aruch is mekel in any event. Tosfos is mekel. The Ramah paskins in accordance to the Arzaliyah. B'mokom she'ein tzorech. In our day and age, yesh tzorech, because most of the people can't afford a separate fridge, and they have no space for a separate fridge. That is reasoning number 1. Reasoning number 2, you always cover this stuff. And you should. You should cover it. Reasoning number 3, if you have a relatively big fridge and there is some separation, you put the meat on one shelf and the dairy products on another. The meat on one side, dairy products on the other side. And that is the psak of the Shach in Yoredei Tzadik Zayin Sif Cotton Lamed above. So this is our brief discussion today in Hilchos Basar B'Chorav. In this week's parasha, Parshas Mishpotim V'Kol Ha'am Royim Es HaKolos. Obviously, it was miraculous. You cannot see voices. You see sights and you hear voices. Chazal say in Mechilta Shoyroyen Es HaNishma V'Shoymen Es HaNera. They saw the voices and they heard the sights. So obviously that was one of the miracles of Mamad Har Sinai. But 2 great Gedolim, a Chassidish leader, a Chassidish master, the Bnei Yissaschar, the Din of Arav. Bnei Yissaschar was an amazing Gadol, and he wrote so many Sforim in all different areas of Torah. Chodesh Sivan Bnei Yissaschar, the Nefesh Chaim Shar Aleph. Both offer a fascinating interpretation. Not a miracle, but what Chazal mean to say, Kodesh Baruch Hu bestowed upon us 5 senses. And all the information we have, we receive, we achieve with those 5 senses. Sight, hearing, tasting, smelling, and the touch of your fingers. Those are the 5 senses that feed us with information. Which is the most reliable, the most tangible? Obviously, sight. Right day Shmiya Gedoyle Maria we find in Chazal. A person will never question what he sees. Be'enai Ru'isi. But in our world, in our Ruchnius, what we hear is far more important than what we see. Most of the most important things in our lives we have never seen and we cannot ever see. You can't see a malach. We never saw a neshama. We never saw shade and veruchos. And most important, ki lo yir'ani ha'adam v'chai. Nobody ever saw Kodesh Baruch Hu. Even Moshe Rabbeinu v'ruisu v'sachoi lai v'ponai lo yiro. We know he's here. We know he exists. We never saw him, but we heard. Avo Yiseinu sipru lanu. So in our world, Shmiya is more important than Riyah. And by Matan Torah, Klal Yisrael achieved such amazing heights. What they heard was so real and so tangible as if they saw. And all this world of Gashmias, of Chayma, of substance, was so far from their interest and their conscience, it is as if they merely heard about it. So that's the interpretation of the Nefesh HaChaim and the Menayos, so somewhat a Musadik approach in Pnimius and in Machshav. So in Bava Basa Ayin Hayes, there's an amazing story. Rabbi Yochanan darsens a posik in Novi, v'samti kot kol shimshur sayach v'shorayach avnei yegdach. Also the Kodesh Baruch Hu, lehevi avonim toim v'mergolias, shem shloisha mamar shloisha mamar v'choykik b'meser aresem v'mamidam b'shai Yerushalayim. Kodesh Baruch Hu niyosad level will bring gems and diamonds. 30 ames and 30 ames, 10 feet, 10 square feet. V'choykik b'meser aresem v'mamidam b'shai Yerushalayim. Ligleg olavayse Talmud. Now one of the Talmidim found it amusing, and he says, we don't find a diamond as big as a tiny egg of a hummingbird. How could there be a diamond 30 amas? He was on a ship, and he sees the malachim, menasem avonim, shloisha mama, and he asks them, what is this for? What are these gems? And they say, Osa Kodesh Baruch Hu Amidim B'Shai Yerushalayim. When he comes back to yeshiva, he storms into the Beis Medrash, so excited, so animated, that he says, Drosh, Rebbe, Drosh, Lachana, Eli Drosh, Kasher Amarta Kein Ruisi. How do you think Rabbi Yochanan responds? Omed v'noshka el Roisha, he kisses him, slams his fist on the table, Talmidim, listen to what this guy has to say. His response is a very harsh and angry one. Reika, lule ra'ita lo hemanta, Yoav be'ena v'asigal shalatzonis. Why that angry response? If he deserves punishment, he should have been punished when he laughed. Not now, when he comes back and he strengthens your words. I think the point is, Reika, lule ra'ita lo hemanta. When Rabbi Yochanan drashes the drasha, you don't believe. You believe only what you see. How could a Jew believe only what he sees? Do you believe in a Kodesh Baruch Hu? You never saw it. Do you believe that every Jew has a neshama? You never saw it. Lule ro'iso lo hemanta. And I think that is why God showed it size. Because a human being without this neshama, which is an invisible neshama, is no more than a bunch of bones and flesh and tendons and organs. So that is and this is something fundamental. Our children and ourselves, we need to believe our transmission, our tradition handed down. Ma'ovis labonim, ve'igadato lemincho, uleven vincho. From one generation to the other. We believe in what we hear. We believe in what we are told. not merely what we see and what we understand. B'kol b'yameinu liyased lovi, as we say every Shabbos Kodesh, v'hu yashmiyenu b'racham avshenes la'enei kol chaylei moyam. Hengu al tiyes chamachas gracious liyois luchem le'elokim. Did you ever think about this? V'hu yashmiyenu la'enei kol chay? Shouldn't it say v'hu yashmiyenu la'oznei kol chay? Or, to the contrary, v'hu yar'einu la'enei kol chay? No. Liyased lovai. We will once again achieve the heights of Matan Torah v'kol olam. Roya misakonis. Roya misanishma v'shoymen esanera. Let us all b'kol b'yameinu. V'hu yashmiyenu b'racham avshenes la'enei kol chay le'imoyim. Hengu al tiyes chamachas gracious liyois lochem le'elokim. Bebias Moshiach tzedkenu b'meheru v'yameinu. Amen.